We are approaching the 2014 date for withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. Now, finally, a clear majority of people in the U.S. think that the Afghan war was a mistake. So, I am wondering if there will be much retelling and misuse, again, of the discourse of women's rights as a justification both for the initial war, and, possibly as a justification for an incomplete withdrawal. The lead up to the Afghan war and post 9/11 used the rhetoric of women's rights to mobilize the American public. We were supposed to save their women from the Taliban and their backward ways. Laura Bush used the language of women's rights to wrap the bombs of war with supposed democratic purpose. But not then, or now, should women's rights ever be launched in the name of imperial democracy. Many anti-imperial feminists in the U.S. mobilized against the initial rollout for war by the Bush administration with its misuse of women's rights as justification. U.S. bombs were wrapped in the defense of women's rights, even though these bombs killed men and women alike. Global misogyny. The Russians, the Taliban and now the U.S. government have all claimed women's protection as their agenda. And for Afghan women, like others elsewhere, there is a huge difference between protection and equality. It is important to pause and to remember the misuse of women's rights as a U.S. strategy to mobilize for the Afghan war in the first place. So I was troubled by the New York Times a few days ago choosing to highlight on their front page, despite West's efforts, Afghan youths cling to traditional ways. Actually, the discussion is about male youths and their continued embrace of misogynist practices and beliefs. The young men are recounting what they expect for their mothers, sisters and wives. Afghanistan is labeled a patriarchal society because of Islam, rather than also because of its history of war and militarism. As for thinking that the West corrupts traditional cultures, well, yes, it often does. The fear is expressed when one male youth says, "If my sister dressed like that, I would kill her." On the other hand, the women's rights legislation that many Afghan men reject and is also seen as corrupting would establish protections that are not yet institutionalized against child marriage, polygamy and violence against women. This is more than messy. Islam is not congruent with women's oppression, and hardly a singular example of it. Yet, right-wing aspects of it allow Western women's rights discourse a specific entry site and should not simply be reduced to imperial interests. Instead of recognizing the deep connection between war, militarism and misogyny, Afghans are labeled simply as traditionalist patriarchs. The Taliban and radical Islamist zealots have been abusive and punishing of Afghan women. But little is simple here. Many Afghan feminists believe in the democratic promissory within Islam as it is articulated by women themselves. And, we should at least remember our own dirty little misogynist secret, the U.S. Armed Services epidemic of sexual harassment and sexual violence. Global misogyny has its many aspects. In Afghanistan it is often a deadly mix between right-wing Talibanization and imperial war. Yafat Suskind of Madre, which sponsors local women's actions in Afghanistan, said in a correspondence to me concerning the New York Times article, "There is no recognition whatsoever that tethering women's rights to U.S. militarism is a surefire way to turn people against women's rights. There is zero understanding of the fact that sustained, as opposed to easily rolled back, progressive change needs to be steeped in an environment of peace. War only shuts down the spaces for women's rights." They quote Amina Mustaqim Jawad, the director of the Afghan Women's Coalition Against Corruption, but still can't see her point. These young men grew up in a war environment. They don't know about their own rights. How can we expect them to know about their sisters' rights, their mother's rights or their wives' rights? Afghan women's continued resistance. It is important to be critical of the U.S. for its imperial wars while recognizing that women's rights are not a Western plot, nor are rights simply of the West. Women from across the globe demand their rights in their own form, and in other than Western ways. There is a complex set of realities for women in Afghanistan. Poverty is overwhelming and getting an education a constant struggle. Afghan women continue to suffer poor nutrition, lack of education, prenatal and preventative health care, and suffer the highest infant mortality rate in the world. Any women's rights agenda must first address these issues that are part and parcel with a ruined war economy and a devastated countryside. Nevertheless, many Afghan women also have been activists on their own behalf long before the U.S. invaded. They have been determined to fight for their rights, to their bodies and their minds, as they understand this in a myriad of ways. The constraining blue burqa was an attempt by conservative forces to curtail their incredible determined resistance. Many Afghan women activists say they are tired of being saved by others. The Russians, the Taliban and now the US government have all claimed women's protection as their agenda, to only soon forget or redefine this determination and turn it towards their own use. And for Afghan women, like others elsewhere, there is a huge difference between protection and equality. This is not to erase the horrific problems that many girls and women face in Afghanistan, but rather to say that the US war on Afghanistan has been as deadly and troublesome to them as is the Taliban. The US has a horrific record of supporting the Taliban during earlier periods of Afghan history, and continuing to negotiate with them during US occupation with little attention to women's rights. Despite Hillary Clinton's promises, the often used equation between women's rights and the West confuses a needed women's agenda. Women's rights are then negated on the linkage with imperial ends, and it makes it all too easy to reject US imperialism and the awful war we leveled as one and the same as democracy for women. And, women's rights US style will not necessarily be the same as Afghan feminist beliefs. Anti-militarism is a necessity of any Afghan women's agenda. But what peace will look like for women's rights and equality is to be determined by Afghan feminists on the ground. I want to emphasize just how utterly important it is to see the fanatic assault on women's rights, no matter where it occurs, as completely antithetical to any expression of democratic living. I am reminded of the right wing of the Republican Party in the US as it hammers away at women's rights to their bodies, whether it be contraception or abortion, with no regard for our well-being. The New York Times piece speaks of tribal justice in Afghanistan, but some of this tribal justice sounds not all that different than pockets in Mississippi, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Texas and Florida in the US. It is important to be critical of the US for its imperial wars while recognizing that women's rights are not a Western plot, nor are rights simply of the West. Women from across the globe demand their rights in their own form, and in other than Western ways. Women's rights, however feminists across the globe choose to define them, are always subversive of misogyny, especially in its imperial forms. Women in the US must look to Afghan women to expand the meanings of democracy beyond its Western forms. This is next on the agenda for democracy across the globe, alongside the full withdrawal of US interests in Afghanistan.